So in today's video, I want to talk about some of the mistakes that I have personally made as a language learner. I also think that these are mistakes that I see a lot of other people making. My hope is that if you watch this video, you guys will be able to recognize that maybe some of these tactics don't really work as well as you think that they do, and it will hopefully give you guys some insight and some tips into better ways to study languages that might be a little bit more efficient, and so you essentially don't make the same mistakes that I did. So mistake number one is not getting enough listening practice at the beginner level. I honestly early on did not spend enough time, in my opinion, listening to content. So what I mean by this is, like, for example, when I was in school and I was learning French, even though my classes and everything were in French, you know, all my professors were not native speakers. It's, in my opinion, not necessarily the same thing as far as from a learning standpoint, because we all have imperfect pronunciation, imperfect intonation. I think that it truly stunted my ability to pronounce things correctly, because if I had incorporated more native listening practice into my language study, I think that my pronunciation and my intonation would have been a lot better. So now whenever I approach a language, I always incorporate listening into my language learning, no matter what stage I'm at. I definitely need some opportunity to listen to these words or these expressions in some kind of context to help me understand the pronunciation and intonation like right away. So the second mistake that I made, which took me a long time to realize I was making, was I took way too many notes when I'm learning languages. I started to notice a trend in other people in the language learning community talking about how they don't take notes. And I thought, this is weird because I tend to take a lot of notes. I actually decided to give it a try myself, and I found that it was just a lot better. And I started to write in my textbooks and in my language learning resources more, which I also thought was like, oh my god, I can't mark up the books. But when I got used to it, I realized I saved so much time. I don't think that taking notes really impacted me so strongly in school. It's because the school curriculum would keep you on track, keep you on pace. You would, you know, somehow make it work. But self-studying Korean, I think I spent a lot of time writing notes. Also, a big thing that I realized is, despite the fact that I'm taking all of these notes, I never really look at them ever again. If I were to write vocab lists or write vocab words down, I usually would put these into a Memrise deck or something like Anki, and then I would use Memrise or Anki to review the words, so I would never need to look at this paper list again. Obviously, I think that taking notes is such a waste of time, and it doesn't really help you learn faster. It just slows you down. Still will take notes sometimes, but I focus more on when it is actually helping me process something. I've started to just mark up textbooks. I'll highlight important things or things I want to remember, and if I really need to, I can look at the textbook again. And mistake number three is learning grammar too quickly. I do think that school might be a little bit better at teaching grammar. The teacher teaching a language class will really facilitate that practice and give a lot of feedback. At the same time, as a self-studier, I think this is such a huge trap that many self-studiers fall into, and I've seen this particularly with people learning Korean as well, is you learn a grammar point and I read some example sentences and I'm like, okay, I understand this, and now I'm going to move on and do some like practice questions. And usually in a lot of Korean textbooks, arguably like any language textbook, there's just like a few fill in the blanks. That's about it. There's like a few grammar drills and then you're done. If you're a self-studier, it's very easy to think, oh, I understand this grammar. I did the drills and I checked my answers with the answer key, and now I'm going to move on to the next one. And then I got to this point though where I felt like I'm not really using this grammar in my day-to-day life. When I come across it, when I hear it, when I read it, I totally understand it, but it never comes out of my mouth. It never even pops up in my mind. I started taking classes a while back with a teacher. She was like, you kind of speak more so at like a very like lower level compared to your overall knowledge. I'm not someone who's very like proud, so it doesn't really like hurt my pride to be told, oh, your speaking is actually kind of like lower. I'm like, okay, that's the problem, so let's go in and fix that problem. It was interesting though because it seemed like there was no grammar that I really needed to learn. We just have to practice it. So that goes to show that you can just power through grammar, understand it, and especially if you are out there asking yourself, oh, I know so much of this language, why can't I speak it? This I think is why. This I think is why so many people cannot speak or actively use a language. I would argue it's actually better to go slow and steady with the grammar and spend a lot of time on active practice, or your reading and listening is going to get so far ahead of your speaking and your writing. And I hate to break it to you, but if that happens, it doesn't matter. Like, if you neglect it now or later, you're gonna have to come back and meet your speaking and writing where it is and get it to catch up with everything else. And this all ties really well into mistake number 4, which is not spending enough time on your active skills. What I mean by active skills are your speaking and writing skills, because speaking and writing requires you to be able to recall something off of the top of your head and use it. Whereas listening and reading are passive skills, because you don't necessarily need to come up with the content yourself. It's kind of provided to you and you just have to understand it. I didn't really learn Korean in a formal setting. Because of that, I never really had to write. I never really dedicated time for writing in Korean because there was never an immediate need for it, and I was never in a situation where I was told to do it, so I just more or less put it off. Because I spend so much time writing in French, I feel very comfortable in my ability to produce French, and this carried over into speaking. The problem was, in the classroom, I'm not really getting a whole lot of speaking practice, and I'm not really like engaging with native speakers. And while writing does help with speaking, you do need to focus on speaking skills as well. You can get a lot of great practice if you have conversations with people in your target language, and you can definitely gain a lot of valuable experiences from that, and it can help you learn language. But you need to really targeting what you're learning and making sure you're actively practicing the new things. So it's really important to target specifically speaking practice with what you're learning, writing practice with what you're learning. Because if you go out and just have a general conversation, it's very easy for that stuff to not even come up in the conversation at all. So mistake number 5 is relying too much on one resource. So whether it is your textbook as a self-studier or the language classroom, yeah, I did this a lot. I would also say that a big mistake I made was focusing too much on this one resource and not balancing it out with other resources or supplemental material. By limiting myself to just the classroom or just focusing on one textbook, I was denying myself these opportunities. I actually think that the most efficient language learning method, process, or whatever is one where you have kind of your main backbone, like this is like what you're gonna focus on so that you can kind of like linearly grow in the language and learn new words and stuff like that. But I think it's important to have a sprinkling of various different contexts. Everything that you can add on top is really going to supplement your learning. If you do that from the very beginning of your language learning journey, you're really going to have, in my opinion, a better exposure to that language. I think it really helps you grow in that language like really efficiently compared to if you just like really focused on your like textbook series. And this ties into my last point, mistake number 6, which is not consuming enough native content. Like I said earlier in the video, when I was learning French in school, I didn't really expose myself too much to French outside the classroom. This was actually a big regret that I have because I did listen to French music at the time, and I think that does help a little bit. But at the same time, back in like 2010 or whatever, I don't know if Netflix was as globally friendly as it kind of is now. And I don't think that there was like a surplus of French language programs to watch. With Korean though, however, I feel like it's a whole different story because there's so many K-dramas online, K-pop. Exposing yourself to native content is really important to really like digest the culture. In my opinion, it's really hard to learn a language and use it well if you really don't know the culture. And the greatest thing about watching programs in the native language is that you can kind of participate in the culture and you can observe things without actually having to be immersed in it. You can just watch how other people interact with each other, how they communicate, how they behave. You can really learn a lot about a culture just by watching different kinds of media in that culture as well. So these were just some of the mistakes that I have personally made as a language learner, and I hope that you guys would find this video helpful, and hopefully it would give you guys some tips and directions so that you can like avoid making the same mistakes as me.